The candle had been burning in the living room of the Fletcher house for 43 days without consuming even a millimeter of wax. Its flame steady and unwavering through power outages and open windows. And the time Patricia tried to suffocate it with a glass jar only to find the flame burning just as bright when she lifted the jar away. And though everyone in the family noticed it, how could they not notice something so fundamentally wrong? No one spoke about it directly, referring to it only in glances and careful roots around the coffee table where it sat like a small patient god, waiting for something, remembering something, bearing witness to something the Fletchers had spent 17 years trying to forget. Patricia had lit the candle on September 14th, the anniversary of her son's death, the way she did every year, one small ritual of remembrance in a house that had systematically eliminated every other trace of him, and she'd expected it to burn for a few hours like normal candles do before guttering out and giving her permission to pack away her grief for another year. But this time, the flame had not gone out, and as days became weeks and weeks became months, Patricia began to understand with a dread that lived in her bones that the candle was not a candle at all, but an accusation, a question, a reckoning that had finally arrived. Patricia Fletcher was 56 years old, married to Robert for 34 years, mother to 2 living children and 1 dead one, living in the same house, in the same main town, where she'd been born and would probably die. Her life had been carefully constructed around routine and respectability, church on Sundays, book club on Tuesdays, volunteer work at the library on Thursdays. She was known as a pillar of the community, a woman who'd weathered tragedy with grace, who never complained, who always had a kind word and a casserole for anyone going through hard times. What people didn't know, what Patricia worked very hard to make sure they didn't know, was that she'd been performing grief for 17 years. That the tragedy everyone thought she'd weathered with grace had actually broken something fundamental inside her, and that the kind words and casseroles were a mask she wore to hide the fact that she felt nothing, absolutely nothing most days. Her son David had died at 15 in a car accident. That was the story. That was what everyone believed. And it was true technically. David had died in a car, and it had been an accident in the legal sense that no one was charged with a crime. But the full truth was more complicated, and the candle that wouldn't go out seemed to know that. Robert noticed the candle on the 3rd day. He came home from his job at the hardware store, walked past the coffee table, stopped, backed up. "Is that the same candle from the weekend?" Patricia looked up from her book. "Yes. It hasn't burned down at all." "No. That's strange." "Yes." They looked at each other, and in that look was the entire architecture of their marriage. All the things they'd agreed not to discuss, all the truths they'd mutually decided to bury, all the ways they'd chosen survival over honesty. "Maybe it's one of those long-lasting candles," Robert said finally, "like the ones they advertise on TV. Maybe." But they both knew it wasn't. This was a regular candle from the grocery store, white, unscented, the kind you buy in bulk for power outages. It should have burned down in hours. Instead, it burned and burned and burned, consuming nothing, producing steady light, refusing to die. Their daughter, Melissa, noticed on day 7. She'd come home from college for a weekend visit and stood in the doorway staring at the candle. "That's still burning?" "Yes," Patricia said. "How?" "We don't know." "Have you tried blowing it out?" "Yes." "And?" "It relights itself, immediately, like it was never out." Melissa moved closer, studying the flame. "That's impossible. We're aware. There has to be a rational explanation. Maybe it's connected to a gas line somehow, or it's electric, and we just think it's a real flame." Patricia and Robert said nothing. They'd already tried every rational explanation. They'd examined the candle, the holder, the table. There was no trick, no hidden mechanism, no rational explanation. This was simply a candle that would not go out. It's David's anniversary, Melissa said quietly. You lit it for David. Yes, and now it won't go out. No. Melissa sat on the couch, her face pale. What does that mean? We don't know, Robert said, though his tone suggested he did know, or suspected, or feared. They ate dinner with the candle burning in the next room, its light visible through the doorway. None of them mentioned it, but none of them could stop glancing toward it, drawn by its impossible presence, its steady flame, its refusal to obey natural law. After Melissa went to bed, Patricia and Robert sat in the living room with the candle between them. We should call someone, Robert said. Who? An exorcist? A physicist? Who do you call about a candle that won't go out? I don't know, but we can't just leave it burning. Why not? Robert looked at her. Because it's not normal. Because it's wrong. Because, he trailed off. Because it reminds you of what we did, Patricia finished. The words hung between them. 17 years of silence, broken. We didn't do anything wrong, Robert said, but his voice lacked conviction. Didn't we? David's death was an accident. The police said so. The investigation said so. The police didn't know everything. The investigation didn't ask the right questions. Patricia? He was 15 years old, Robert, and he asked us for help. He asked us multiple times. And we said no. Robert stood up abruptly. I'm not doing this. Not now. Not after 17 years. Then when? When will we do it? When will we finally talk about what really happened? But Robert was already leaving the room, climbing the stairs, shutting the bedroom door, leaving Patricia alone with the candle and the memories she'd worked so hard to suppress. David had been troubled. That was the word everyone used. Troubled. He'd started withdrawing at 13, spending more time alone, his grades dropping, his friends drifting away. Patricia and Robert had noticed but hadn't been overly concerned. Teenage moods, they'd thought. A phase. By 14, David was cutting himself. Patricia had found the razors, the scars on his arms. She'd been horrified, angry, scared. She'd demanded he stop, had taken away anything sharp, had watched him constantly. But she hadn't gotten him professional help, because that would mean admitting something was really wrong, that her son needed more than she could provide, that she'd somehow failed as a mother. At 15, David had asked directly for help. Mom, I think I need to see someone, a therapist. I can't keep feeling like this. And Patricia, terrified of what that would mean, the judgment, the stigma, the admission that her perfect family wasn't perfect, had said, "You're fine. You just need to try harder. Be more positive. Think about all the good things in your life." 2 weeks later, David had died. Crashed his car into a tree on Route 7 on a clear day with good visibility. The police ruled it an accident. Fell asleep at the wheel, they said, or distracted. But Patricia had found the note in his room afterward, the note she'd never shown anyone. The note that said, "I asked for help, and no one listened." She'd destroyed that note, burned it in the fireplace. And then she'd worked very hard to convince herself that David's death really had been an accident, that the note had been a teenage exaggeration, that she hadn't failed him, hadn't killed him through negligence and pride. But apparently, the universe disagreed, or David disagreed, or her own conscience, manifesting as an impossible candle, disagreed. That night, Patricia dreamed of David. He was 15, standing in the living room, looking at the candle. "You finally remembered," he said. "I never forgot." "You did. You worked very hard to forget, to make it an accident instead of what it really was. It was an accident. Was it? When someone asks for help and you refuse to give it and they die, is that an accident? Or is that a choice?" Patricia woke up crying, and in the darkness of her bedroom, she could see candlelight seeping under the door, brighter than it should be, casting shadows that moved wrong, that looked almost like a teenage boy standing, watching, waiting. Days passed. The candle continued burning. Patricia tried everything. She tried smothering it, drowning it, putting it in the freezer. Nothing worked. The flame persisted, steady and relentless, impossible to extinguish. People started noticing. Friends who visited would comment on it, would try to blow it out as a joke, and be unsettled when it immediately reignited. The mailman saw it through the window and asked about it. The pastor mentioned it after church. Quite a remarkable candle you have, Patricia. Almost miraculous. Miraculous, that was one word for it. Haunted was another. Melissa came home again 3 weeks into the candles burning and found her mother sitting in the dark, just watching the flame. "Mom, are you okay?" Patricia didn't answer right away. Then, "Do you remember your brother?" "Of course I remember David." "What do you remember about the year before he died?" Melissa sat down beside her mother. "I remember he was sad, really sad. And you and Dad kept saying he'd grow out of it, that it was just teenage stuff." "Did you think that was true?" "No, I thought he needed help. I told you that. Multiple times. But you said I was overreacting. I was wrong." "I know." They sat in silence, watching the flame dance. "The candle is for David," Melissa said. "It's burning because he won't let us forget. Candles can't do that. This one can. There has to be a rational explanation." "Does there? Or are you just more comfortable with impossible physics than you are with impossible guilt?" The question struck Patricia like a slap, because Melissa was right. She'd spent 3 weeks trying to explain the candle scientifically because that was easier than accepting the spiritual explanation, the one that said her dead son was keeping a flame lit to remind her of what she'd done, of the help she'd refused to give, of the life she'd failed to save. "What do I do?" Patricia whispered. "Tell the truth. Finally. Really tell it. Not the version where David's death was a tragic accident, but the truth about why he was driving recklessly that day, about what he was running from, about what you refused to see." "I can't. People will judge me. They'll know I failed him. They'll know you're human, that you made a mistake, that you're finally being honest about it. I can't." Melissa stood up. "Then the candle will keep burning, because you lit it to remember David, and David is making sure you actually do remember, not the sanitized version, but the real one." She left Patricia alone with the flame. That night, Robert came home late from a business meeting. He'd been staying out later and later, Patricia realized, avoiding the house, avoiding the candle, avoiding the conversation they both knew needed to happen. She was waiting for him in the living room, the candle between them. "We need to talk about David," she said. "Patricia, I'm tired. We failed him. We need to admit that, out loud, to each other, to everyone who'll listen." Robert sank into his chair, and in the candlelight, he looked old, defeated. What good will it do? He's still dead. Admitting we were wrong won't bring him back. No. But maybe it will let him rest. And maybe it will let us rest too. I can't tell people that I ignored my son's cry for help, that I chose my pride, my fear of judgment over his mental health, that I'm responsible for his death. We're responsible, both of us, together. "The candle," Robert said, looking at it. "You think it's David? You think he's somehow keeping it lit?" "I think it's a reminder. Whether David's spirit is involved or it's just our own guilt made manifest, it's showing us that some things can't be buried, some truths won't stay hidden, some deaths demand acknowledgement." They sat in silence until dawn, watching the flame that wouldn't die, and slowly, gradually, they began to talk. Really talk. About David's depression, about the signs they'd missed or chosen to ignore, about the help they'd refused to get, about the note Patricia had burned, about 17 years of pretending and performing and carefully maintaining a lie. By the time the sun rose, they'd cried more than they'd cried in 17 years combined. And when the pastor called that afternoon to check on them, Patricia told him they needed to talk. The truth came out slowly, carefully, in private conversations at first, the pastor who listened without judgment and suggested grief counseling, Melissa, who cried and said she'd known all along but hadn't known how to make them acknowledge it, close friends who were shocked but ultimately supportive. And then, 3 months after the candle had first refused to go out, Patricia stood up at a community mental health fundraiser and told David's real story. Not the sanitized version about a tragic accident, but the truth about a teenage boy who'd been crying for help, about parents who'd been too scared and proud to hear him, about a preventable death that haunted her every single day. "My son asked me for help," Patricia said, her voice shaking but clear. "And I said no. I said he was fine, that he just needed to try harder, to be more positive, and 2 weeks later, he killed himself. He crashed his car deliberately because living had become too painful, and I had refused to give him the tools to cope with that pain." The room was silent except for Patricia's voice and the sound of people crying. "I'm telling you this because I don't want another parent to make my mistake. I don't want another family to spend 17 years lying about what happened, pretending grief is the same as guilt, acting like love is enough when sometimes what's needed is professional help and medication and years of therapy. David needed more than I was willing to admit, and he died because of my pride. But maybe his death can mean something if it prevents even one parent from making the same choice I did." She sat down trembling, and Robert took her hand. They'd agreed he would speak too, but he couldn't. The tears were too thick, the regret too powerful. So Patricia had spoken for both of them, had finally told the truth they'd buried for 17 years. That night, they came home to find the candle extinguished. For the first time in 91 days, the flame was out. The wick was black, the wax slightly pooled but otherwise unchanged. It looked like an ordinary candle that had burned for a few hours and been properly extinguished. Patricia picked it up, held it, felt the weight of it. Then she went upstairs to David's room. They'd kept it exactly as it had been, a shrine no one entered, and placed the candle on his desk. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not letting us forget, for making us finally tell the truth." The candle didn't relight. Its work was done. Life didn't magically improve after the truth came out. Patricia and Robert still carried their guilt, still missed their son, still had to live with the knowledge of what they'd done. But they lived differently. They supported mental health initiatives in David's name. They spoke at schools about the importance of taking teenagers seriously when they asked for help. They went to therapy themselves, working through their grief and guilt with professional support they denied their son. And they learned to forgive themselves slowly, imperfectly, day by day. Not because they deserved forgiveness, but because carrying unforgiven guilt forever wasn't honoring David's memory. It was just continuing to fail him by failing themselves. Melissa graduated, got married, had children. She named her son David. Patricia cried when she heard, good tears this time, grateful that her grandson would carry his uncle's name forward, would be a living reminder of a boy who'd mattered, who'd suffered, who'd been failed, but who wouldn't be forgotten. On the 17th anniversary of David's death, 17 years after he'd died, not 17 years after they'd started telling the truth, Patricia lit a new candle. A regular candle, one that burned for 3 hours and then went out naturally, the way candles are supposed to do. "Rest easy, David," she said to the darkness, to the empty room, to the son who'd been gone so long, but who'd finally been properly mourned. "We remember now. We tell the truth now. You can let go." And whether by coincidence or something more, that night Patricia slept dreamlessly for the first time in 17 years, unvisited by guilt or ghosts or the weight of secrets too heavy to carry alone. In houses across the world, candles burn in windows and on mantles, and beside photographs of the departed, and most of them burn normally, consuming wax and oxygen until they gutter out as physics dictates they must. But sometimes, rarely but sometimes, a flame refuses to die, continues burning long past any natural explanation. And when this happens, we call it miracle, or curse, or impossible, depending on whether we're ready to face what that persistent flame is trying to tell us. Because fire doesn't just consume, it also illuminates, and sometimes what it illuminates is the truth we've been hiding even from ourselves, the guilt we've been performing away, the love we confused with control, the help we refused to give because giving it would mean admitting we weren't enough. And those flames burn until someone finally looks at them directly, finally acknowledges what they represent, finally speaks the unspeakable truth that lets the dead rest and the living begin to heal. And only then, only after confession and acknowledgement and the hard work of forgiveness, does the impossible flame consent to die, leaving behind an ordinary candle and extraordinary people who learn that sometimes the most haunted places aren't houses, but hearts that refuse to tell the truth.